Debbie, did Debbie say we have a quorum? I don't.
Yes.
Okay, I guess I'm not seeing there's Commissioner Serrano.
Hey, Ray.
Okay, all right, good. So let me call the meeting to order. And it's good to see everybody. So welcome, thank you for making the time to be here. And just an FYI, interested members of the public are joining us today through a video only link. And so I'm fairly certain I'm right in saying this, we won't see them on the screen here with us, but they are able to view what's going on at our meeting. And I don't have much else to say. I just want to do a quick review of the agenda, and then I'll hand things over to Secretary Fielder. We have one action item today, and that's to approve the COMAR amendments regarding the Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship. And then, as you all know, we have a rather lengthy document detailing some COMAR changes to cover the regulation around transferring from public institutions of higher education. And we have that today just so that we can begin to raise any questions or comments that we have. We then have some time to still reflect on it some more before we bring it back in March, do a final review, and then ask for an adoption of those changes. And as you all know, this is a really important issue because it increases the transparency for students. So they have greater awareness of how their courses will transfer to another institution. And it also helps to advance the state goal of increasing the percentage of our citizens who hold a degree from a higher education institution. And then our remaining items are for information only also, and Ms. McGowan will be presenting those to us having to do with program review, veterans benefits, and private career schools. And I know Secretary Fielder is going to update us on the governor's green bag announcements. So Secretary Fielder, let me turn things over to you.
Thank you and welcome everyone. We're now at 48 days remaining in our legislative cycle, and we're in the middle of budget hearings and bill hearings, some of which have very much direct impact on our regulations, especially transfer. So we'll be keeping you updated on that. And now the governor's green bag was delivered just last week, and I'm pleased to announce that we have two nominees, retired Baltimore County Circuit Court Judge Barbara Howe and former Superintendent Karen Salmon. So both of them will have to go through the process that Halima just went through. You go through the executive nominating committee. Each of you have been through it for review, and then the full Senate, and then swearing in, and then they can join us. So I'm excited about having both of those very professional women joining us. Not that the others aren't already professional that are here. I didn't mean to imply that, but I just
we take no offense. That's okay.
Oh, okay, good. The other part that's happening is the consultant that was named in the legislative DLS, Department of Legislative Services consultant RFP, was selected in October, and we've had our first two discussions with him so far. We have another one scheduled for next week. So we'll be attending to all their requests for information and data. They are looking at to really review our process in terms of prevention of academic duplication. And the good news is I think we're going to find out what some of the other states are doing in the same manner, which I think will be helpful for us. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much an update that I have. That's all. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Secretary Fielder. We'll look forward to having those two new members join us and hope they get through the process quickly. So, okay, there are no public comments today. And so the first order of business is to approve the minutes from January 26th. So if I could have a motion to approve, just to get it on the floor, and a second, Commissioner Serrano, and could I have a second?
Second.
Adequate, thank you. So any additions or corrections, amendments from anybody? If not, all in favor, please either raise your hand or say aye to approve the minutes.
Aye.
Anyone opposed or abstaining? Okay. And Commissioner Cohen, I assume your hand's up to approve. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's begin with committee updates. And Commissioner Boyd, anything to report on the Education Policy Committee?
Well, as you've already mentioned, SOMA provided us with a ton of information about the upcoming discussion on the transfer policy articulation agreements that Emily and Simone have been working on for so long. We are going to have our meeting on March the 14th, which is a Monday, a little bit of a change for us just in terms of the timing. But given the amount of information we needed to read, we needed that kind of lead time. And I'm really excited about this one because if there's anything that the commission does that impacts so many students at one time, this is it. So anyone who's willing to come to the Education Committee meeting on the 14th, you're welcome. And hopefully you get to go through that material before we get there.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Commissioner Boyd? Okay, Commissioner Coleman, outreach grants and financial assistance.
Yes, I've asked Commissioner Adekola to give the report today because of my allergies bothering me.
Okay, all right. I'm sorry that you're having to put up with that. That's aggravating. Commissioner Adekoya.
Yes, so we received updates that in an effort to offer more students access to higher education, MHEC is working with MSDE and College Bound to help push the countdown to the FAFSA/MSFAA deadline by March 1st by promoting all of the MHEC scholarships and grants that students may be eligible to receive if they fill out the FAFSA/MSFA. So efforts include, into your question, Commissioner Boyd, earlier, efforts include a new Instagram account for social media updates and support, also through Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. They're also producing a podcast every 2 weeks to promote and encourage listeners to take advantage of the numerous programs EMIC has to offer. There's already been produced the Student Loan Debt Relief Tax Credit Program and the MHEC Veteran Affairs and State Approving Agency. And if any commissioners have any idea or requests for a podcast, you can definitely email and share your ideas, and we can work on that on the monthly calendar. Additionally, last year, MHEC began working with the Anne Arundel County Office of Social Services in an ongoing effort to get Anne Arundel Hispanic student parents who are working on their GED signed up for the Maryland State Financial Aid application, the state version of the FAFSA and the MD CAPS. I definitely asked if this could be a widespread initiative beyond Anne Arundel County, and I was told that yes, with the right partnerships, we can definitely make this a widespread initiative. It's just a matter of trust for our students and parents and the partnerships in place in our many communities that can help us bridge the gap. So that is my update.
Good, thank you, Commissioner Adekoya. Any questions? Okay, again, thank you for the report. And Mr. Newman, anything from Finance and Operations?
Good afternoon, everyone. As the Secretary mentioned, we have had several budget hearings so far. We've had the higher education overview, the aid to community colleges, and the student financial assistance budget hearings that I think all went relatively well. Next week, we have our MHEC agency budget hearing in each house. We haven't received the analysis for it yet, but we're anticipating it soon. That will conclude our operating budget hearings, and then we'll have two short hearings about the capital budget following that. We have been we're continuing to work to fill the vacant pins in the agency. I know there are some interviews occurring next week for a position in Aubrey Bascom's budget and administration area. So we continue to work on that. And I think that's about all I have.
Great, thank you. Any questions at all? One very general question, anything you're concerned about in the hearings?
No, I don't think so. We initially had some concerns in the higher ed overview with a few questions that came at us. But then once we got to the student financial assistance budget hearing where the questions were addressed, I think everything went pretty smoothly. I don't know, Secretary Fielder, do you have any reaction?
No, I wouldn't get anything to that. We reached out to a number of the legislators to try to answer questions in anticipation of hearings. And that helped a lot, and we will continue to do that through the rest of the session.
Great. Okay, thank you. Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, DEI, Commissioner McDaniels isn't with us. Commissioner Serrano, do you have anything that you could report on?
Not really. We haven't had a meeting since the last meeting that we had. So I'm trying to check my calendar to see when the next meetings have, but I know we're meeting soon. The last meeting that we had to provide a few things to kind of guide some of the questions for the progress of 55, but I think for the most part, we don't have anything to report now.
Okay, all right, thank you. So we'll look forward.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to also thank the DEI committee because their recommendations that were given to Dr. Schmertz then presented it. We changed the outreach letter for our cultural diversity reports. So that was updated yesterday in final draft to go out. And I appreciate their work.
Great, thank you. A good step. So, okay, with that, Dr. Dow, let me turn things over to you on the Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship changes.
Absolutely, and I'm actually going to tag team this with Donna Thomas, our Director for Office of Student Financial Assistance. So, Donna, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, everyone. Donna Thomas, Director for the Office of Student Financial Assistance. On page 6 of the commission booklet, you will find the memo for final adoption of COMAR amendments for the Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship. On November 17th, the commission approved the proposed amendments to the regulations for the Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship, which provides financial support to students who enroll in a group of non-credit courses at a community college that will lead them to a degree, are related to job preparation and registered apprenticeship, licensure certification, or job skill enhancement programs. The purpose of these amendments is to incorporate changes to the definition of eligible students that was passed during the 2020 legislative session. The proposed amendments were published in the Maryland Register on January 3rd, 2022. The comment period for the amendments ended on February 2nd, and there were no public comments received. The regulatory amendments became eligible for adoption on February 18th, 2022. The amendments will become effective 10 days after notice of final adoption is published in the Maryland Register. The recommendation, it is recommended that the commission approves for final adoption the enclosed amendments to the regulations for the Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship Program. Happy to take any questions that anyone may have.
Good, thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Okay, so the recommendation is there in the materials, and so the motion would be to approve for final adoption the enclosed amendments to the regulations regarding for the Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship. So I would ask somebody to move that motion.
Commissioner Boyd, I so move.
Thank you. In a second.
Jim Coleman, second.
Thank you, Commissioner Coleman. So all in favor, please say aye or raise your hands. Aye. Hands might be. Anyone opposed or abstaining? Okay, the motion carries. So those get final approval. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Dr. Dow, still with you. You get the fun of this very lengthy document. So why don't you give us some context and then we'll see what questions people have.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Commissioners. Just as the Chair mentioned, this is a fairly lengthy document with some pretty extensive changes to our regulations regarding transfer, general education, and even a little bit of program review. I will be honest, when I started drafting my presentation for this afternoon, I ended initially with about 50 different slides and realized that was going to be way too much. So I've tried to tailor what I'm going to share with you to the most important pieces of information and really highlight some of the novel changes that are being made. So just know that there's more in the drafted regulations than what I'm about to go over. And I really would encourage you to take some time between now and the March meeting to review these regulations in detail. We really would like everybody to give us feedback, make sure that we've kind of plugged every hole in the transfer credit loss problem that we often hear about from students and from institutions. So with that, let me share my screen. I do have some slides prepared. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to try to keep myself to 15 minutes. So, okay.
Dr. Knapp, could I also ask, in case people want a clarification along the way, is that okay with you?
Absolutely. Please stop and ask me questions. I may not be able to see you, so feel free to just interrupt me and speak up. So yes, absolutely. A little bit of background, the Transfer with Success Act was passed last legislative session. The Transfer with Success Act does two things. One, it created a new requirement for public institutions to jointly review credits or courses that are denied when a student transfers from one public institution to another. Previous to this legislation, there was no mechanism for the two institutions, no legal mechanism requiring institutions to talk about denial of credit when it happens. It also created a new annual reporting requirement where institutions will have to submit to the commission a report listing all the denials, including the reasons for each denial. So as an agency, we will now start to have some insight to the denial of credit and particularly the reason. So with this new piece of legislation, we put together a transfer work group to evaluate our current regulations, create new regulations that align with the statute, and make appropriate changes. So you'll see here, it's also in the memo, the members of this work group really represent our stakeholders, the University System of Maryland, MICUA. We have a number of community college representatives that have participated in these discussions, and we've met almost monthly, if not twice a month since this summer to discuss these issues. I also want to give a shout out, kind of an unofficial, but very much official participant in all of this work has been Soma Kadia, our Assistant Attorney General. She's really crafted these regulations in a way that they are strong regulations. They are clear, they are concise, and it's with her expertise that I'm very confident that these are great regulations. So want to give her the due credit that she has deserved for this work. So just some highlights. Like I said, I'm not going to go through every piece of paper that's in front of you. So I have kind of cherry picked what I think is most important for you all to hear about in the next few minutes. As a reminder, most of these regulations, like 95% of these regulations, only apply to our public institutions. There's only kind of one sliver that would apply to our private and independent institutions. And just to remind you of our public institutions, we have 16 community colleges in the state of Maryland. We have several universities, colleges and universities that fall under the University System of Maryland. And then we have two other public four-year institutions that run independently, Morgan State and St. Mary's. So just to give you some context, the public institutions are primarily affected by these changes. First and foremost, we are really leaning on articulation agreements when it comes to transfer. We started that work about 3 years ago when we pulled together a work group to discuss applied baccalaureate degrees at community colleges, and realized articulation agreements really is the space to provide detailed information around the transfer of courses and programmatic requirements when students move from institution A to institution B. However, in this most recent revision of regulations, we realized that we probably need to further define specific types of articulation. So for example, in the drafted regulations, you'll find a definition and the term program transfer agreement used frequently. This is a specific type of articulation that is unique to specific programs. So for example, a community college student who is starting off in engineering will have ideally a program transfer agreement for a four-year institution in an appropriate engineering four-year degree. So program transfer agreement as a specific type of articulation agreement. Another type is a course transfer agreement. This is agnostic to a program, but can provide information about course transfer, just course transfer. Regardless of program, this course will be accepted at a four-year institution or at another institution. And the third type of articulation agreement that we have defined is a prior learning transfer agreement. This is really specific to prior learning opportunities and experiences, things like internship, clinical experiences, standardized exams like advanced placement or CLEP. So you'll see these terms used frequently throughout the drafted regulations, and most importantly, this idea of a program transfer agreement as a specific type of articulation agreement. Not new to this process, but important, I think, for me to highlight is we will now require institutions to provide articulation agreements through the academic program review. So when we receive an academic program proposal for an undergraduate degree, an institution will need to provide a proposed articulation agreement. And it will need to be a fairly complete articulation agreement, still proposed, not necessarily fully executed, but it needs to have details around course-to-course equivalencies, admissions requirements. There are internship requirements, so on and so forth. If a campus already has an existing articulation agreement, then we want to see revisions in light of that curricular change that may be happening. And if it's not appropriate to have an articulation agreement, why? There may be times where either a community college or a four-year institution, there just isn't a partner institution in the state, or the program doesn't really lend itself to an articulation or a transfer opportunity. So we'll allow institutions to give us a justification. But really, as part of the curriculum development and through academic program proposals, institutions will now need to be thinking about transfer much more prominently than before.
Could I ask a question here, that on the proposed articulation agreement, is that something they do with a single institution if they choose to do that? Okay. So they just have to have at least one with one institution.
Exactly. At least one with one other institution. We've left it open. Of course, they could do a articulation agreement with multiple institutions, but yeah, we're looking for at least one to say there's a partnership here that transfer students will be able to take advantage of, and that the curriculums align, that there would be course transferability, and the two institutions have been thoughtful about the design of the curricula. General education is now in its own chapter. Our current regulations, the general education transfer stuff, it's buried, it's hard to find, so we've pulled it out. It doesn't have a lot of changes. They're very minor, just clarifications and a general reorganization, but I think that will help clarify the requirements of gen ed and keep it separate from transfer issues. Then we get to kind of the brand new stuff, brand new information, COMAR 13B0602. You'll see that it has 14 different regulations within this chapter and highlights requirements for institutional policies, information for students, admissions requirements. So again, please, if you can, take a look, read through these pages, with a thought in mind about students being able to maximize and students having the knowledge to be able to navigate transfer in a way that they can be successful. Again, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I am going to highlight a few items for your attention. We have new definitions and revised definitions. We have a new definition for academic credit or credit. We have a new definition for credit for prior learning. We have a new definition of what a course is. We have a new definition for a learning objective or a learning outcome. We've changed the term of native student to non-transfer student to be culturally sensitive. We have a new definition of program or academic program. We've slightly changed the definition of transfer student in terms of what it means to be a transfer student and credit requirements. And we've completely removed any language referencing recommended transfer programs. It's an old term. It's not something that we've been able to operationalize well. And so anytime we've seen that language, we've replaced it with things like an articulation agreement or a program transfer agreement, something that's a little bit more concrete that we can wrap our teeth around. Transfer coordinators are part of all of this. They will be crucial individuals. This already exists in regulations, but I want to emphasize that they will be again, crucial individuals through this process. They're going to be responsible for implementing all of this, but what they are not responsible for and what is new to the regulations is this fourth item. They're not responsible for determining course equivalencies or credit for prior learning. That really should live with faculty who are subject matter experts. And so you'll see language in the drafted regulations that speak to this point, and we wanted to clarify that distinction of what a transfer coordinator is and what they're not. We've also made sure that included in the regulations is the Student Transfer Advisory Committee. It's established through statute, but phases out at the end of June of this year. So we've included language that advisory committee remains standing and still addresses student transfer issues as the committee has been doing for a number of years. So let's get into some nitty-gritty details about transfer of courses and credits. Just to be clear, and this is not new, but just to be clear, general education courses should transfer, no questions asked. If you've taken a general education course at a community college, that should transfer to a four-year institution. The transfer should be applied to the same core area at the receiving institution. So if you've taken a course that meets a social science requirement or a math requirement, then that's what it should transfer at the receiving institution. And it should happen regardless if there's an equivalent course. So we've talked hypothetically, what if it's a Shakespeare course that meets a composition requirement, but they have a British literature course instead? We don't care. It doesn't matter. They met a gen ed requirement. It should transfer, again, no questions asked. What's going to be really important is that the registrars, and I know many of the campuses do this, if not all of the campuses, public institutions are going to have to designate on a transcript that a particular course has met a gen ed requirement. There has to be some way to communicate to a receiving institution which courses meet gen ed requirements. New to these regulations, and I think is really quite novel, and I think worth really highlighting, is what we are calling a 70% rule. So when we talk about course equivalencies, how do we decide that two courses are exactly the same? The work group had proposed the 70% rule, and I have since shopped it around with various other stakeholders. And essentially what it is a course at a sending institution is deemed equivalent when the receiving institution determines that at least 70% of the course learning outcomes are the same for a course at the receiving institution. So we've left it at learning outcomes as the mechanism to determine course equivalencies. It shouldn't have anything to do with whether or not it was a distance ed or a face-to-face course. It shouldn't matter about what textbook was used. It shouldn't matter what assessments were used. If the learning objectives were met, then the learning objectives were met, and that's it. It shouldn't matter if it was a summer course versus a fall or spring semester course. Again, we've made a definition for learning objective or learning outcome. just so we're clear as what that means. And again, no other standard can be used to determine equivalency, and we cannot consider, or institutions should not consider course numbers or levels. We heard from the campuses that this gets particularly sticky when we're talking about 200 level or 300 level courses, and some accreditors give campuses trouble when it comes to transfer. That the determination of a 200 level, 300 level course is sometimes very institutionally based. And so we've said that that should not have meaning in determining course equivalencies for learning objectives. What this is going to mean, though, very functionally, is that campuses are going to have to be very specific about their learning objectives, and they're going to have to start including learning objectives in course descriptions, things that you see in course catalogs at a minimum. A professor or faculty could go beyond those learning objectives, but what's the minimum learning objective for a course, regardless of the section or regardless of the faculty member teaching it? So this is going to be interesting. There's general support for this new 70% rule. It will create some new requirements. Again, it's going to challenge institutions to think about how they do course design. I had a whole separate meeting with the Faculty Advisory Council on this issue to make sure they were comfortable with this, and that's where we debated highly about this idea of textbooks and modality and whether or not it was an intensive 8-week course versus a traditional 16-week course and what that all means. And they really landed with, it's about learning outcomes. Even within the same institution and the same course could be taught very differently depending on who's teaching it. So why would we hold transfer students to a higher standard than what may be even happening within its own institution? So that's our new 70% rule. So let me get into the evaluation and review process. This, again, is also brand new to our regulations. Does pretty much stem from that legislation, the Transfer with Success Act. There's 5 steps in the process where there's going to be a transfer evaluation request, an evaluation of course or credit. There's going to be a report that they have to do. There's going to be a review of the denial, and then there's going to be a final determination. Oh, yes.
Sorry. So going back to the platform that we talked about in terms of for the institutions, is that for community colleges to 4-year university, or is that within like 4-year colleges or 4-year universities to 4-year universities?
It's for everybody. It's a great question. A lot of my examples, I realize, have been the traditional community college to 4-year institution. This applies to any movement between any public institution. So community college to community college, 4-year to 4-year, and even 4-year to community college. So it's any movement from one public institution to another, all of this applies.
Okay. And so if the institutions are kind of intransigent to basically try to saying, well, this class is taught at a particular format at this university, we're not budging with this other university, how do you reconcile that? How do you like, I guess, use the stick instead of the carrot?
Right. So that's a great question. To be quite honest, in the absence of data, we don't know how often that happens. We don't know where the resistance lies, and we don't know in what context that resistance is happening. So that we can, as a commission, as a regulatory agency, as a coordinating agency, can step in and try to assist students. So we'll have insight to that through that data collection, that annual data collection. So we expect that to happen next summer, and we'll start to be able to better understand reasons for denial of credit and where there are problems and challenges. So that it's a good question because this evaluation and review process gives us insight into that and that and that detail, that level of detail of why there's a denial of credit. So for the step 1, there's going to be a transfer evaluation request by students. Thank you, Commissioner Serrano. I appreciate that question. Transfer evaluation. So first and foremost, to do this transfer, a student needs to submit a request. We've heard from some campuses that students will just send in a transcript and there's an assumption that everything on the transcript is intended to be transferred, and then it's not. And so this needs to be initiated by students. So they submit a request. The request has to be in the form and manner required by the institution. So we're giving institutions some flexibility in terms of what they're going to expect. They will likely expect course syllabi. So at some point, we're going to have to inform students. They should be keeping course syllabi. They should be keeping various information about their registration so that if they do go to transfer, they have that information at hand. They're not having to log into an old account or find those documents. That's going to be some of their responsibility. And the request should identify each completed course and credit that the student desires to transfer to the receiving institution. There may be, we want to give students the agency to identify the courses that they want evaluated for transfer and think through that. So students will be asked to do that on their own accord. They, of course, can check every box and say evaluate everything, but if there's something that they don't want to evaluate, then they should be able to communicate that. The second step is an evaluation of course or credit. So the receiving institution is going to ask themselves two different questions. The first question is this course or credit actually transferable? So is there a program transfer agreement or some other agreement or course equivalency or an institutional policy that establishes that this is transferable? Does the course credit fulfill a general education requirement? Is there a course equivalency? So outside of that first one, if maybe there's no program transfer agreement, then they need to go back and say, okay, well, is there a course equivalency? Let's go through that process. Is the credit equivalent for credit for prior learning? So these are going to be 4 questions the transfer coordinator will need to ask themselves. If yes to at least one of these, then it's transferable and we move on to part 2. If no to all of these, then the course or credit is denied for transfer. And that will be communicated back to the student. So the campus is going to have to think through these 4 elements to establish transferability. So if it is transferable, then part 2 is where are we going to apply that credit? Is it going to get applied to a gen ed requirement? Is it getting applied to an academic program requirement, an elective requirement, some other institutional or programmatic requirement, or any combination of these? This is going to be tricky because we all know students change their majors often and maybe more than once. So this part will, if a student does change their major, this part may change, but it will not change part 1 decision of transferability. That will be that will be regardless of whether the course applies or not. It is does the course transfer? So this is going to be an important distinction to communicate to the campuses and think through procedurally how we provide guidance to campuses to separate these 2 issues of transferability and application of credit or courses. There's one little carve out. We do have a limit, a maximum for which community college courses, no more than 70 credits can be transferred from a community college to a 4-year institution. And so if that's the case, then campuses should really transfer the most valuable courses. So they need to be thoughtful so that courses are not getting transferred with kind of empty credit that doesn't fall into one of these boxes. And they're going to have to provide justification and detailed explanation on how they do that. The third step is a transfer evaluation report. There's lots of elements required in the transfer evaluation report, things like everything that we've just talked about. Fully explain to the student if the course or credit has been accepted for transfer or denied, so everything on that part 1. If it has been accepted, where it belongs. If it's been denied, why, a clear and detailed explanation. If it's been denied because they're over the 70 credit limit, a clear and detailed explanation of how they've kind of reordered or maximized the courses. And a statement that the sending institution is going to review this without further action on the part of the student, and a contact person, the contact information for a particular person at the receiving institution. And this goes to both the student and the sending institution at the same time. So this should be kind of an automatic process. Then step 4, the sending institution gets to conduct their own analysis. And they get to say, do we agree or disagree with the receiving institution evaluation of denial? The sending institution shouldn't really be commenting on where the courses fit, that part 2 fit, but they should really be focused on whether or not the course or credit is being denied and whether or not the sending institution agrees with that decision. So the sending institution would provide an analysis, send it back to the receiving institution. A meeting could be set up. A meeting is actually required, but the institutions can waive out of that if it doesn't seem necessary or appropriate. And then the sending institution will either revise the analysis or provide written notification that they're not going to revise their analysis and give it finally back to the receiving institution. And then there's a final determination. So the receiving institution says, great, we've met with the sending institution, we've talked about their analysis. And so then the receiving institution either does a revised transfer evaluation report, or they tell the student, no changes have been made, we're done, transfer evaluation report sits as is. And then the decision arising out of that review process is final and is not subject to appeal. All in all, from the start of a student sending in their evaluation request to this final determination should take about 80 days. We've tried to time it so that it takes place within ideally 1 semester. And so that students can then plan accordingly and figure out the next set of courses that they need to take depending on the transferability. Again, there's an annual report that the commission will receive. The quote here is direct from statute. I want to be clear, this is not a transfer collection. This will be a narrow data collection around the denial of credit. It's actually going to be more, it's going to give us more information or more detailed information around transfer than kind of a traditional transfer collection. Some additional notes just for your consideration. Like I said, agreements, policies, rules, procedures, throughout the drafted regulations, we've said that they should be publicly available. I have heard from students and from faculty, a lot of these things live behind a login, or they're not even evaluated until a student is actually enrolled. And we all see that problematic because if a student is not going to maximize on their transferability, and they go to transfer to another institution and they don't know what's going to be, we've lost them. We've already made them have too much time. They're likely going to have to repeat courses. They're not well informed. So all of this stuff needs to be public facing, needs to live on websites, needs to live in course catalogs.
Could I ask about so when you mentioned going to your previous slide on the denial, like would that include also like so say a university, the receiving university says we will not take, well, we will take the credits that you have from a community college, for example, but we will not apply them towards your major. We'll apply them towards as an elective. Is that considered a denial? And would that be captured?
Yeah, so we're actually trying to think through those details right now. We'd like to be able to capture that. We also want to give institutions flexibility and it's not just institutional flexibility. There are, what I hear, there are some really stringent accreditors out there, programmatic accreditors. So nursing and accounting and other entities come in and look at curriculum and they'll look at these transfer agreements, and there may be reasons outside of the institution's capacity that would limit them from accepting transfer. So that's why those program transfer agreements are going to be so essential. Sorry, I'm not answering your question. We hope to have insight into where those courses get bucketed into to maximize. but due to institutional issues, accreditation issues, students changing majors, I'm hesitant to rely on that information to give us insight. I'd like for us to first focus on that part one, is the credit even getting transferred? And then look at the part two, where is it getting applied, and is it getting applied in the most maximum way possible?
And Emily,
Mm-hmm.
could you take a moment and just describe the difference between this approach with the transfer as well as compared to a very strong articulation agreement?
Sure. Well, and that's it. And so a strong articulation agreement, such as a program transfer agreement, that PTA, we're calling them PTAs now, that's going to give the roadmap for a transfer student to take the right courses at the community college and be able to transfer to a 4-year. That's going to be the specialized course curriculum. And essentially, if you think about it, it's going to be its own unique program. Me as a student started at a community college. I took 60 credits at the community college. I took the remaining 60 credits at the 4-year institution, and I walk away with both an associate's and a bachelor's degree. And so I have kind of a unique programmatic experience by virtue of that program transfer agreement. It's almost like it's its own program. And so those agreements are going to be so crucial to making sure that students are well informed and there's a commitment from both institutions to accept the coursework, to teach the coursework in a way that matches those learning outcomes and leads to success for the student.
Yeah, and I think one of the key differences is with the articulation agreement, that all is agreed by both the 2-year and the 4-year before the student even starts the courses.
Absolutely.
Whereas the traditional transfer, you get a couple, 18 months or a year in, and then you find out.
Exactly.
So, this is going to help with that.
I think Commissioner Adekoya has a question or comment.
Yes, so I've shared this before in our educational policy meeting. So far, what I see is just providing clarity. A lot of transfer students will tell you that transferring is one of the hardest things, just because of the lack thereof of clarity in the language. So far, I'm really happy with the edits that have been proposed, and I look forward to really dive in deeper to seeing how they help students at the end of the day. I did have one question, and I truly might have missed this, but in the creation of the edits, were students ever contacted and or like town halls, small groups? In that, my wheelhouse is not transfer students, but I do have friends who have transferred, and I almost wonder were they contacted to see if this form of edits really speaks to their needs or speaks to the needs they once had.
Great question, Commissioner Adekoya. Thank you. So I think in full transparency, I think the short answer is no. We've not necessarily engaged students. Where I think is going to be crucial is actually, because all of these have been created in a way where they are student focused, it is about the student and student success. What's going to be crucial in our next steps is creating student guidance and making sure that students know their rights, know that institutions are expected to do X, Y, and Z, and know what this process looks like. And I think us as a statewide agency have the responsibility to start creating some of those publications, absent and again agnostic of institutional policies. So that's where I feel like that will be the next step, is to engage students on that level to make sure that they know what needs to happen and again what their rights are.
And Commissioner Boyd, you're muted.
It's for Emily. You may have already addressed this. It has to do with this policy that really sounds very sophisticated and very appropriate, is only intended for schools in the state of Maryland. Is that correct?
Correct. Only the public institutions in Maryland.
Yes, and you said something about maybe some of the private. So
Yeah.
what happens to who's a student whose home is here in Maryland? They've been in a community college out of state. Is that going to eventually be addressed in terms of the schools here?
Again, the short answer is no. We wouldn't have authority necessarily, or at least our regulations don't address that. And I think often of Frostburg State University, Salisbury, UMES, kind of our border institutions. I know they work very collaboratively with community colleges in Pennsylvania and Delaware and West Virginia. And so there may be students that do transfer to those institutions from those out-of-state community colleges. The hope would be that they just follow these rules anyway, that they would still do these kind of transfer evaluations, that students would have a report at the end so that they understand where things are going to get bucketed and what's getting denied and what isn't. Not every institution is doing this on such a sophisticated level. So I would imagine that institutions would be able to pick this up and apply it to any student. In terms of enforcement, this only applies to our public institutions in Maryland and transfer between public institutions in Maryland.
Okay. The other question, a real quick one, is there any limit on the age of the courses that you're attempting to transfer in?
That is a great question. And we have debated this quite a bit, both internally and with the stakeholders. It was an item that the work group talked about, an item that the faculty advisory committee talked about. We ultimately ended up not including age of credit as an element. The thinking is you've learned it and therefore you've demonstrated competencies. I admit that could easily be a hard pill to swallow, especially in the hard sciences and in mathematics. I'm sure if we were all giving calculus tests right now, I'm not confident I would be able to pass that calculus test, even though I passed it in college.
You won't be alone.
Yeah. So Commissioner Boyd, I would welcome you to bring that up as an issue at the Education Policy Committee. And if you think that that's important, that we do incorporate or allow for limitations around age of credit, I think it's an important issue.
Okay.
And if I could just jump in on that, because it seems to me it's important to also capture institutions' experience, that maybe they start out saying, okay, we'll agree that something's equivalent. It looks like there's 70% of common learning outcomes, and yet when the students get there, they experience it's not working. So there's got to be some means of allowing that experience to play in.
Agreed. And one of the meetings that I attended in preparing all of this was a stakeholder with the provost at the USM institutions, and they mentioned just that, particularly with prerequisites for particular courses, that you talk about 70% of meeting course equivalency, and then are we setting students up for failure? Is the end of when there's sequences of courses where you really do need to have a certain base level of knowledge to be successful in the next sequence of course. And so engineering, math, those hard sciences where there is a building of knowledge and skills, there is some hesitancy for that. That conversation somewhat landed, well, that's anecdotal, and in the absence of evidence, we're potentially harming students without that data, and requiring students to retake courses that they would argue they have already taken and they know the information. So Commissioner Surkamp, I think you're right. I think, again, institutions are going to have to be just a lot more thoughtful and think about doing analyses and doing the work to see what makes sense and what doesn't.
I had a quick question. Is there anything in the like the guidance that on grades transferring? So if somebody has like an A in a community college class, and would it be transferred as pass fail, or would it be transferred as a C or an A? And how that would affect GPA from the receiving institution?
Great question. Yeah, so we do have language in the drafted regulations. The student needs to earn the grade that is required for a non-transfer student. So they have to meet the standard at the receiving institution. So if a receiving institution says you have to get a B in order to move on and progress, then the community college student is going to have to get a B in whatever that course, whatever equivalent course that would be. A C would not be sufficient. So the transfer student and the transfer student should not be held to a higher standard when it comes to grades and grade requirements compared to a non-transfer student.
But is there guidance from like the receiving institution that they would respect the grade that was assigned at the community college? So if a student had like a calculus class in community college that was an A, the receiving institution would also respect the A from that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We are pretty silent. The drafted regulations are silent on that issue in terms of, and particularly around calculating GPA. That's a good point. If you have recommendations, or if you think that our regulations should require a certain standard, again, I welcome it. So that's why we've given you some time to look these over and provide feedback.
Because I think, I mean, in some cases you see students that they would have a low GPA at a four-year university. They stop out, they take classes at a community college to try to better their GPA. But if the classes at the community college are not, if the grades from those classes are not taken in by the four-year university, then they've kind of just done that for nothing. It doesn't really better their GPA and rehabilitate them to get back to the four-year university.
So,
great point.
Secretary Fielder, did you have something?
Yes, commissioners. I think what Commissioner Serrano is raising is a very, very important question. Just getting this progress alone on the transfers without limiting the autonomy of the 4 years on accepting, because the 4 years don't even agree on whether an AP course 1, 2, or 3 is acceptable, let alone the grades. When you start talking about somebody going into engineering or organic chemistry, the 4-year institutions want some autonomy in evaluating. So we're trying to push it as hard as we can and get acceptance to move it forward.
Mhm.
And Commissioner Serrano, were you suggesting that perhaps grades should be transferred in? I wasn't quite understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a question of like simply getting the credits transferred. That's one issue. The other one is what do they get applied to? They get applied to a major as they go as elective, and then I think the final frontier would be the grades. And so, would a grade from a community college be respected at a four-year university?
Yeah.
But I think
So I'm going to show my bias here, but just to reinforce Secretary Fielder's response, I think that would be a hard pill for most institutions to swallow, that the grades would actually transfer in. And so what a community college student obviously should always do is submit both transcripts, community college transcript and the bachelor's degree transcript.
I just have one more slide. So you'll just see additional notes, everything that we've already talked about here. Next steps, just in the immediate 4 weeks, I'm going to follow up with the community college registrars. That's not supposed to be February 18th. That's supposed to be this Friday, February 25th. I apologize. So this Friday, I'm meeting with the community college registrars. The work group is meeting again on March 3rd to review the final drafts. And then, of course, the Education Policy Committee is meeting on March 14th. So I welcome all the commissioners to attend that as a public convening for which commissioners can give us additional recommendations or changes, or if you have questions. That way, when we come to you at the March commission meeting on the 23rd, we can fully propose regulations for us to start the AAL process and move that forward. So really we would like you to give us feedback if you do have any proposed changes at the March 14th Education Policy Committee. And I'll also be able to update you on my meetings with the registrar and the work group in general. Again, we need to finalize our guidance document. We have that drafted. We have the base bones for it. That's going to include annual report guidance, Commissioner Serrano, to your point. And then Commissioner Adekoya, we need to develop student-specific guidance, which we will absolutely 100% engage students. And I'd like to do that before the end of this academic year, so that information is circulated over the summer for students who are transferring into the fall semester. I think that's it. So I'm going to stop presenting.
Let's see.
A little bit longer than 15 minutes, but I appreciate you bearing with me and allowing me to provide.
Right. There were questions and comments along the way. So any other questions or comments? I'm going to jump in. I have one other thing to make certain that I'm understanding it. On page 20, when it talks about the timing of receiving the evaluation, and it says that when a student makes a request, should get a response within 20 days. And then the next statement says, but if the transcripts are received 20 business days before the start of the semester, so there's more time allowed, but you're not requiring that it's done except to be done by the start of the semester. I guess I didn't understand that distinction.
Absolutely. So what we're trying to do there is, particularly for prospective students, that they can submit their transcripts before they've even enrolled, before they've even, and so if that's the case, then the institution, and so you think about it, they're going to be just hit with all sorts of requests during the summer and even winter terms. We've said we're going to give you a little bit more time to do it, just so that the student can be well informed by the start of the semester that they've registered for the right classes. They're not registering for repeat classes. The whole process will not have been completed, but at least they would get that initial transfer evaluation report to help inform them for their registration.
Yeah, and maybe we could talk a little bit more about that, Emily, offline, because my concern would be you wait to the start of the semester, that's awfully late for them to be changing schedules and things are closed. And so you would hope that they would get a report by the time they're actually registering for courses. So just something to think about.
Yeah, no, that's helpful feedback. And we can certainly take that back and think through timing so that it does, again, it gives students every benefit to be successful and register for the right courses.
Anything else that anybody has now? We get another shot at this. Actually, we can get 2 shots if you want to join the Education Policy Committee. And then we get another shot at the commission meeting.
And so what I'll do is I will make sure that everybody has a link to the Education Policy Committee meeting. I realized I didn't put the time. It's at 3 p.m. On that Monday. Either myself or Debbie will circulate that just so that you have the link and you're just welcome to join.
Yeah. Well, again, there was a great overview, and I know a lot of work on your part and Soma's part. So thank you both very much for getting this ready for us to take an early look at it. And it looks like there are no other comments at this point. So Miss McGowan, I will turn things over to you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Trish Gordon-McCown, the Director of Academic Affairs, and I am reporting on the quarterly reports for third quarter. These are the first report is covering institutions of higher education program review, and these are the Secretary's actions from July 1st of 2021 to September 30 of 2021. During this reporting period, we had 223 total actions. Within those actions, 35 of them were for independent colleges and universities, 50 were for our 4-year public colleges and universities, and 57 were for the public community colleges. In addition, in this report, the details will outline the Secretary's actions for our out-of-state institutions, which during this time period, there were 51 total out-of-state actions. as well as our online registration institutions. Those actions were a total of 30, hence the 223 total actions. Also of note, within this period, there were 4 objections that were finalized for the quarter. One of those objections regarding a program proposed by Hagerstown Community College, one was approved, and the other 3 were either not approved or not recommended. Just to give you some context around the out-of-state institution actions, the institution actions for the quarter involved the renewal of programs that were due during that time period. The reason why our numbers or the institution renewal programs change is most of our institutions are under extended renewal. We've advised in previous reports that there is an extended approval period for 5 years for those institutions to meet a certain threshold. So this review period, we had 51 total actions for renewals and for new programs. I'm going to stop right there because there's a lot of detail within this report, just to see if there are any questions, comments, or concerns about Q3.
Just a note, Trish, your team has done such a tremendous job when you think of over 200 actions. And one of the notes on page 88, 89, if you look at it, it's a very innovative approach by Morgan State University, submitted 18 program requests, baccalaureate, master's, and doctor's. So all 3, all being interdisciplinary and recognition of prior learning. So prior learning credits. So we are working with them closely and hope everything goes very, very well. Yeah, they've got their largest freshman class ever. So a lot going on there.
Thank you for that note, Secretary. I must mention that that unit is under the leadership of Karen King Sheridan, and the 2 analysts that support the out-of-state and the online registrations are Jacqueline Cade and Bryson Barksdale.
Yeah, but you're still the head of that.
Can't
So
do it
reach your
alone.
hand real high and bend it. You can go like that. You know?
So,
Yeah, I
any
definitely
other-
do not do this alone.
Yes. No, none of us can.
No.
So before we move on, any other questions or comments? I think we're good, Trish.
Okay, thank you. The second report for Q3 is the Secretary's actions for our private career schools. Again, this period is from July 1st of 2021 to September 30th of 2021. There were 24 total actions for this unit. The unit is led by Dr. Ashley Wallace and supported by Eric Jackson, which is the education analyst for private career schools. The report will detail the 24 actions during this period. If you just take note of the training provider questionnaires, the unit is responsible for reviewing entities' training that they're offering to see if they that training does require approval by the Secretary of Higher Education. So the training provider questionnaires will either determine if the institution is exempt from the regulations, not regulated, or not exempt, which means they would require the approval of the Secretary and must to operate in the state. The actions within this report, again, are 24 total. And I will stop there and see if there are any questions or comments regarding Q3's report.
Anything from anyone? I think we're good.
Okay. And the final report for Q3 is for the Veterans Affairs unit, which is also the Maryland State Approving Agency for Veterans Education and Training Benefits, administered by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Just note that on this report, it is Q3. However, the reported numbers were reported based on the federal fiscal year, which would be their Q4, which ends on September 30 of 2021. The total actions for the Veterans Affairs Unit was a total of 987 program-related actions. These actions include approval actions for new and/or existing approved programs that are used for veterans education, benefits, and training. Additional actions taken by the unit includes their technical assistance to those institutions, students, and the certifying officials within those institutions. This unit also is responsible for a number of on-site and reviews and inspections. So that's included within their number as well. And in addition, they have a number of liaison activities to support those individuals statewide and federally that are also responsible for administering veterans education and training benefits. At the end of the report, you will notice that this unit is responsible for programs related to apprenticeship, correspondence courses, flight programs, institutions of higher learning, licensing and certification. Those are exams for licensure, and our non-college degree program, and also on-the-job training. I will stop there and see if there are any questions or comments, anything I can clarify regarding Veterans Affairs.
Secretary Fielder? You're muted.
And that was such a good speech. Anyway, Trish formerly headed this unit up, and each of you should know and recognize it continues to receive the highest evaluation, highest level awards from the federal government on their work for veterans. They also undertook a very heavy lift in supporting a community college that was under threats of loss of every program that they were doing on the aviation side because of potential lack of information and proper record keeping. And this staff with Trish's leadership did a phenomenal job of supporting that community college to be back, and everything is moving fine now. So I really wanted to recognize that. There's no other way to recognize. I don't have big dollar bills or anything like that. So thank you.
So a big thank you to you, Trish, and your team. So that's all really important. So thank you.
Thank you. I must acknowledge my Associate Director, Everett Jackson, and his analysts, Wayne Holmes and Oyata Rigsby, which are long-term analysts with the unit, and they do an excellent job, and they're supported by Priscilla Hicks.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I think that completes our agenda for today. Does anybody have any other business to raise?
Excuse me. I'd like to ask the question. We've talked a little bit about whether we should start planning for return in person. I've had Debbie inquire about us being able to do kind of a hybrid for those that want to be in person, and then others that would simply be able to join by TV. And we know we're limited right now in technology to do that, but we can certainly accommodate, the in-person, and then those that would just want to join by phone, but you wouldn't get to see our pretty faces. So at some point in the near future, I would recommend that we start looking at that.
So Secretary Fielder, because we don't have a lot of people with us today. How about if we just did a quick polling offline as to if people are comfortable doing online? I just facilitated a board meeting that was hybrid, and it was disastrous. I mean, unless you have excellent technology, it just doesn't work. So if commissioners are comfortable, I would be in favor of seeing if we could start to meet in person again. But there are a couple of commissioners still with us. Anybody else want to weigh in?
We'll do a little bit more research in terms of trying to see what technology has to be changed to be able to do the hybrid model.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
It's a bit difficult for me. Like I'm at telework now, so I'm like kind of at home most of the time. But I need to be. Well, I could probably fit it in. Just the commute back and forth and to step away from work, and then. But I mean, I guess if we do move in person, I'll be fine with that. I would prefer to be This is just
virtual.
easier for me. But,
Yes.
I would actually prefer the hybrid model only because of some situations that I'm trying to handle. So the commute is difficult for me.
Got it. Okay. Commissioner Cohen, I thought I saw you raise your hand. Any opinion?
No, I was giving Tricia a hand.
Okay, got it. You got another hand there, Trish. That
I'm also, I prefer going back to in-person meetings.
okay. Okay, well, we'll do some more checking with everyone and try to figure out what's the best option. Secretary Fielder, anything else you want to raise before we adjourn?
No, just everybody be safe, and we'll see you in March 23rd, I think is the date.
Okay, I don't know if I really need to always have a formal adjournment, but if somebody would move to adjourn, we can close this meeting. One of my commissioners move to adjourn. Thank you, Commissioner Serrano. And somebody can, I guess I can second it. So we are adjourned and we'll see everybody. The next meeting is March 23rd. And the education policy is March 14th, Emily, and you'll send us the link on that. Okay, sounds good. Everyone take care.
Thank you all.